So all the students are joined on Zoom.
But I asked them to come here. None of them are in this on demand.
Worst attendance is very sad.
So all the students of C, you should join in person if you can. एक मोबाइल से लॉगिन कर लो मोहन जी कौन मोबाइल से लॉगिन कर लो और okay, so so
I don't know if it's working. Is it working? Is the mic working? No, you can hear me well. We can hear you. I think you can hear me, but apparently there's some.
मोबाइल से लॉगिन कर लो और होस्ट बन जाओ इसको फिर होस्ट डिसेबल कर देते हैं
It's working. I don't know.
Okay, so a very good afternoon to all of you. So it's a pleasure to have Dr. Shibani Ghosh from Center of Policy Research in Delhi, who is also a practicing lawyer to IIT Kanpur. She is the board member of Chandrakanta Keshavan Research Center for Energy Policy and Climate Solutions at IIT Kanpur. So today, Ms. Ghosh will be talking about regulating air quality in India, challenges and the way forward. So before we ask her to give her talk, let me just briefly tell about her. So Shibani is a fellow at the Center of Policy Research in New Delhi, which is a think tank in India working extensively on policy related matters on various topics. She's an advocate on record at the Supreme Court of India. She specializes in environmental law and appears in cases before the Supreme Court and National Green Tribunal. Her research focuses on environmental regulation, governance, and air quality. She has authored several articles, chapters, and opinion pieces on environmental issues. She has also edited a book, volume titled Indian Environmental Law, Key Concepts and Principles, published by Orient Black Swan. This book provides in-depth case law-based analysis of Indian environmental jurisprudence. So with this, over to you, Shibani. So
Thank you.
Let me just do a couple of security related things here so that there is no hack here. Please.
Thank you. So is it best if I stand here? Is that
Yeah, that may be better, but you can move
okay?
around if you
No, whatever is easiest for all the infrastructure that's in
want.
place. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here in this campus. I've never been to IIT Kanpur or Kanpur, so I really jumped at the opportunity when it was offered to be able to come here and be amongst all of you. Well, I've chosen a topic here today, which is something that I work on, or many of us at Center for Policy Research work on various aspects of, which is air quality. But given my training in law, I thought I'll give kind of an overview, kind of an angle to it, which is on regulation, governance, a bit of the legal aspect, which perhaps may be something new, something to for some of you who are working in these areas, related areas of environmental policy making, or are interested, may find this of some interest. So I'm not sure how you want to, I'm happy to kind of give a talk for about 25 minutes and then open this up for questions and answers. But I also understand some of this might be a bit legal technical. So if you have any specific questions and want me to stop and explain something or go back, I'm happy to take questions while I go ahead. So perhaps some of you in the room know, are experts on the technical side of air quality and air pollution and emissions and pollutants and measuring and monitoring. So please do forgive me if I'm using some technical words or using them wrongly, but the intention is all good. So today's talk, I thought I'll kind of focus more on the challenges and what I think could possibly be the way forward. And of course, this is just identifying some of the challenges and some of the ways in which we can perhaps change our regulations, think of reform, and there are many other ways, I'm sure, and I'm happy to get into a discussion about them as well. So, okay. Yeah, I think it's okay. So a quick outline, just give you, the nature and scale of the crisis that we are facing in India. And then moving on to an overview of what air quality regulation looks like in India, kind of breaking it up into various bits. So give you an idea of what the regulatory framework is, what the institutional framework is, what are the key regulatory tools that our regulators have and they can use. Very briefly, what the policy framework is, and then moving on to what the key challenges are and kind of envisioning what the way forward could be. So just throwing some numbers there. And I think you might have seen all of this in newspapers or pieces that you come across. We are notorious. We are on the top 20, 30 lists of everything there has to be on poor air quality. 35 of the 50 most polluted cities in the world are in India. Our annual average particulate matter 2.5 concentration estimated to be more than twice the acceptable national standards. 241 out of the 331 cities that were studied in one of these reports don't comply with air quality standards for PM. The idea of actually even putting some of these numbers out was to address the myth that often goes around in air quality regulation that air pollution is either a seasonal problem, or it's an urban-centric city problem, or it's Delhi's problem, which is perhaps the worst myth. Because poor air quality is really a nationwide problem. Several studies have shown there's actually no significant gap between urban, rural, in terms of exposure, in terms of pollution. A study has shown 83% of the entire Indian population, irrespective of where they reside, is exposed to air quality that does not meet our national PM standards, which incidentally is much worse than the WHO standards. And in 2019, the ambient PM 2.5 concentration exceeded in almost all states. And the states in which it didn't exceed are kind of the obvious ones, which are either the hilly states or in the northeastern part of the country, which don't have much industry, or the sources of emissions are far fewer. In terms of health outcomes, mounting evidence, I mean, apart from the obvious ones that we think we correlate with air pollution, which is respiratory, cardiovascular, pulmonary diseases, there's so much more evidence that's coming not only from international bodies and agencies, but also from national institutes and collaborations which show increased risk to diabetes, prenatal disorders, There is a impact on intelligence quotient. So a lot of evidence coming out on adverse health outcomes due to air pollution. In 2019, air pollution, and here I want to stress on it's both ambient and household, so indoor air pollution as well, was found to be the leading risk factor for premature deaths in the country, and according to one estimate, leading to 1.67 million deaths in India. In terms of economic losses, which is, of course, very hard to estimate, but studies are showing massive numbers. For instance, one study said 3% of India's GDP loss in 2019 due to air pollution, while another estimated total welfare losses to be 7.7% of the GDP. So this really puts the kind of the nature and scale in perspective, that this is not an environmental and ecological issue. It's clearly a public health crisis. It's an economic crisis, and it's just likely to aggravate more and more as we continue to be unable to control it in any way or form. Very quickly, just kind of, this is not what I want to go into much detail, but just as a background, what are the major sources of pollution? And I don't say them in any particular order, because various parts of the countries have it in different source attribution, reveals different attribution of sources, and their importance are different. And there are certain other sources which are not listed here. So of course, industries and power plants, waste burning, and in that I'm including both burnings at, say, landfills that you may have heard of, but also crop residue burning, which is in the last 4 or 5 years has become a much more topical issue, particularly in the Indo-Gangetic plains. Transport, vehicular pollution has typically been the center of a lot of air quality policy making in the northern part of the country. But it's not just vehicular pollution, but also there's evidence showing shipping, airlines, all of these are also causing emissions. Construction and road dust is a significant contributor. And finally, increasing evidence showing that household sources of pollution, such as required for cooking or heating, are actually very important sources of not only household indoor pollution, but also ambient air pollution. So in terms of the regulatory framework, and in today's talk, I'll concentrate really on the central laws and regulations. I'm fully cognizant, and I must at this point acknowledge that something like air quality cannot and should not be regulated only by national laws or by the central government. And there's a critical role to be played by subnational, state level laws or municipal laws and bodies. But just for the purpose of this presentation, I'll concentrate and focus on the central laws, rules, and some of the notifications as well. So the two, and I'll not go into too much detail, just kind of giving you a flavor. The two of our earlier laws which are relevant are the Water Act and the Air Act. The reason I put Water Act is because our main regulators, the Central Pollution Control Board and the State Pollution Control Board, as well as pollution control committees in every union territory, are actually set up under the Water Act. So the composition, the powers and functions actually flow initially from the Water Act of 1974, and that was subsequently expanded under the Air Act. Air Act is, you would think the air is comprehensive with regard to issues of air pollution in India, but they're not. It is not. The Air Act actually concentrates only on big point sources of pollution, so mainly industries, power plants, a little bit on vehicular pollution, but even not that much. But the reason why Air Act is important is because all the powers of the pollution control boards with regard to air quality actually flow from the Air Act. And when we hear of things like if any particular standard has been issued or consents have been issued to particular factories or sources of emissions, those are all issued under the Water Act and the Air Act. The other law that is quite relevant and important from the perspective of air quality is actually the Environment Protection Act 1986, which came later on. And the reason, apart from the fact that it actually regulates specific sources, so SWM is solid waste management, construction and demolition waste. So those are specific sources of air pollution. It's actually the environment protection rules which say, which lay down the emission standards for various industries, various processes and manufacturing units. The actual emission standards are actually laid down in the environment protection rules. Apart from that, of course, we have the EI notification, the coastal regulatory zone notification. All of these, though, do not sound like they are focused on air quality, but given that they lead to industries or development projects either being allowed in a particular place or disallowed or in some way regulated in an area, in that sense, they are relevant for the purposes of air quality in a particular area. The other two laws that are relevant, and just to kind of give you a sense of what's there, is the National Green Tribunal Act, which set up this specialized court called the National Green Tribunal, which deals with a lot of these cases relating to air quality. Earlier, we would hear the Supreme Court, and we've heard a lot of, well, the Supreme Court, one of the reasons it's quite famous, called the Green Court, called an activist court, and there is some debate about that, is the famous CNG case where the court directed the public transport in Delhi to move from diesel to CNG. So many of those kind of cases are now actually heard by the specialized court called the National Green Tribunal. This other new kid on the block is a law passed in 2021, which is a Commission for Air Quality Management in NCR and adjoining areas. It's a mouthful. It basically set up this new institution called the Commission for Air Quality Management, CAQM, which is focused on air quality in the National Capital Region and areas around it. It's very new. Its functioning we're still trying to figure out, and I think the Commission itself is trying to figure out its powers and functions and how it can implement its mandate. Just those were all basically environmental laws, but there are of course several other laws which are relevant, but they don't fall necessarily in the ambit of environmental laws. The Motor Vehicles Act, because when all of us who have vehicles, we need to get PUCs. You may have heard about the Bharat Stage BS4, BS6 standards that most vehicles now have to comply with. That's under Motor Vehicles Act and the rules. And there are, of course, many other laws we can think of which are either directly or indirectly in some way either causing air pollution or could be used as hooks to mitigate air pollution, such as the Energy Conservation Act and then electricity. Yes, please.
On the air quality laws, so has the law become more stringent, or in terms of regulations?
Yes.
Like have the norms remained the same, or norms have become more stringent? And is there a progression on that line?
Right. Oh, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think, first of all, they kind of operate in different spaces. So it's within this, there is no kind of a linearity in time. But there are, for instance, under the EI notification, one could argue that some of the provisions have become more lenient. In fact, in environmental laws, more generally, there has been a move for ease of doing business, which has meant that a lot of things, including air quality standards or requirements to meet that, have become more lenient. Yeah, so I mean, in the sense, you have to meet, it's easier to meet them if that, yeah, exactly. On the other hand, you could say, I think, to answer your question in spirit rather than letter, that it may not have changed. If something has not changed in the book, the implementation could also have become more lenient. In a sense that the regulator has too much to do and just looks the other way. So that's something that I think in the institutional framework, I want to particularly emphasize on that, all this is nice and fancy and there's a lot more behind this, but really it comes to the people who are on the ground who have to actually implement the regulation, the regulators themselves who are highly incapacitated to actually do all of this.
The only place where they progressively became more stringent is this our BS standards.
Yeah, you're right. And some would argue that the Supreme Court was the backstop there because while I won't take credit away from where it's due that the central government did come up with the standards, you're absolutely right. I mean, in that sense, yes. But there was a very, very strong pushback in actually implementing the deadline, which the Supreme Court kind of had held fast. Yes. So in that sense, I think when we're discussing the institutions, I think the judiciary in that sense does in some ways play an important role. And as I said, of course, there are subnational laws and regulations which are very important. I'm not going into details, but for instance, if you're looking at waste burning, stubble burning, construction waste, all of this actually requires municipal, urban, local bodies to play a much more active role. And even by law, A lot of the powers and functions lie with urban local, municipal corporations, urban local bodies, state governments, than the central government. Yes.
The Energy Conservation Act and Electricity Act.
Yes.
Is there any common between these two acts, or there are no commonalities between these two?
I honestly, I should not speak to it because I don't work in these areas. But I mean, I'm just thinking that in terms of, for instance, power plants and emission standards relating to power plants, those are, while they're issued by the Ministry of Environment, the regulators that are set up under the Electricity Act will have a say in terms of how those emission standards are actually implemented. At the same time, the Energy Conservation Act and the structure under the Energy Conservation Act comes into play because how efficient are the power plants and things like that. But I cannot honestly give you answer that question directly, unfortunately. Okay, so as I was talking about the institutional framework, as a colleague of mine calls it an institutional thicket, because there's really, given that we have multiple sources and then we have multiple levels of governance, it's really a network, very intricate network of institutions working, and sometimes there's very little clarity on where the accountability lies, which is of course one of the major problems and challenges. At the central level, of course, the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change, which is a nodal agency, but recently, in fact, Ministry of Earth Sciences is also moving towards engaging with that, which makes sense, of course. As I said, the pollution control boards, both the center and the state pollution control boards, which are set up under the Water Act and the Air Act, they are responsible for point source of pollution and issuing consents, regulating the conditions and enforcing the conditions and monitoring their compliance. Environment departments in every state. I mentioned the newly set up Commission on Air Quality Management and its predecessor, which some of you may have heard of, the EPCA, which was in place for about 20 years. It was set up by the central government on direction of the Supreme Court, and it basically had the jurisdiction to look at air quality in the National Capital Region. Of course, it had a wider ambit, but that's what it focused on. Then there are appellate authorities under the Water Act and the Air Act as well. And finally, the urban local bodies, as I mentioned, which are increasingly expected to play a role in air quality management for reasons that we can discuss a little later. The other two kind of angles to this institutional framework, and these are not regulators. I think the first six, as I've highlighted up, could be considered to be government agencies, regulators in some senses, or even decision-making bodies, is the judiciary and also the role of the private person or the citizen. So the judiciary, as I mentioned earlier, of course, has played a very important role in environmental cases, but in particularly in air quality related cases. It's identified the right to clean air as a right under Article 21, the right to life. Then there have been various judgments of the Supreme Court and the High Courts, and now more recently of the National Green Tribunal, such as the switch to CNG. I just talked about Bharat Stage 4 and 6. There have been regulations passed on use of firecrackers during Diwali, and the introduction of green crackers, which led a lot of us puzzled because we didn't know what they were. I think there is still lack of clarity on that, but apparently those are allowed. The issue of stubble burning, which was before the court for a few years. At one point, they were taking it very strictly, and they said every farmer to the Chief Secretary of Punjab will be individually held responsible if we find even one fire. 2 days later, they softened their stance and said, no, we must incentivize it and things like that. But that stubble burning issue is now more before the Commission on Air Quality Management and not so much before the Supreme Court. And finally, just the role of the private actors or the citizens. Of course, a lot of advocacy happening in North India, but I think it's many other parts of the country are also now actively advocating for clean air and kind of really putting the limelight on what's causing the air quality crisis, air pollution crisis in the country. And media, of course, is playing an increasingly important role in all this. But also just want to point out, that there are a lot of third parties or private players now involved in regulation. And perhaps some of you see that in your engagement with the government, and these third parties could also be institutes of premier education, such as IIT Kanpur, which are involved in monitoring or environmental audits, they could be knowledge partners of regulators, trying to help them figure out solutions to problems that they are facing because they lack the internal capacity. So in that sense, increasingly we are seeing, and I think in some senses it's good that research institutions, academic institutions, policy research areas are now increasingly, the government is reaching out to them, engaging with them, collaborating with them in some senses. What the outcome is variable depending on the situation, but certainly there is more participation from such organization. In terms of what are the regulatory tools, and I'll go over them quickly. So of course, these emission standards are prescribed by various bodies, such as the National Ambient Air Quality Standards or specific emission standards for industries. So in some senses, they call this a command and control kind of a mechanism, where you kind of say, this is what you need to meet. If you don't meet this, if you go over this emission standard, then something will happen. So a carrot and stick policy, basically saying you need to meet these standards. So that's one way of doing it. And an example in which that's activated is most, for instance, factories or industries who want to set up have to get a consent to operate and a consent to establish. These are consents under the Air Act and Water Act. They have to get it before they set up. And those consents will actually list out what the emission norms are and what they have to meet. So that's one way. Another way, and it's related to what I said, the consent or clearance granting mechanism. Then there is many of the regulators can issue directions. So some of you may come across continuous emissions monitoring systems that are some categories of industries, highly polluting industries, now have to mandatorily put them up. So that kind of requirement to put it in some categories of industries comes through the power to issue directions, which pollution control boards, the environment ministry, the environment departments have under the law. And industry categorization, citing criteria. So industries are categorized as red, orange, green, white, white being least polluting, red being hazardously polluting. And therefore, for instance, in dense urban agglomerations, red category industries will not be permitted. They'll be required to go out of the city or urban area limits. And similarly, there are other citing criteria, such as if it's a critically polluted area, then certain industries will not be permitted there. What are the enforcement mechanisms that these regulators have? Again, they can issue directions. Now, these directions are different. They can actually close down an industry if they find it to be polluting. They can direct the closure, disconnection of their power and water, which basically means the industry cannot function. They can give other directions, such as you have to put in this kind of mitigation, emission mitigation equipment has to be put up in your industry, otherwise we'll not allow you to function. So these are the kind of directions that they can issue. Something that's relatively recent, actually both bank guarantees and environmental compensation. Interestingly, neither of these have an explicit mention in the Air Act, but these are increasingly being used by regulators. And the reason is that regulators are not interested in going to courts. They have the power to go to criminal courts to prosecute. These are considered crimes. Air pollution is considered a crime under the law. But actually going for criminal prosecution is resource intensive, time intensive. No one's really interested. It takes 17 years and nothing really happens. 17 was just an example. So they'd rather go down a route which has some impact, whether it's a monetary form of deterrence or making the polluter pay in some way. So what happens for bank guarantees is now some pollution control boards and some departments, before they give a clearance, they say you, depending on the size of the industry or the regulated entity, the size and the investment or expended, a percentage of that, say 10 lakh rupees, 15 lakh rupees, you have to deposit as a bank guarantee as a condition of your clearance. And if you're found to not comply with a condition or violate any of the conditions, then they just forfeit some of the money. So, and the advantage of that is that money is already in the bank. So they cannot, and that's how bank guarantees work. That's how a forfeiture of a bank guarantee works. The other thing is they are now requiring polluters or those who are found to be polluting or violating emission norms to pay environmental compensation. The Central Pollution Control Board has come up with a formula of assessing how much compensation has to be paid. A lot of the states have either adopted that or customize it in some ways. But this is also something new, relatively new, and it's being seen as a more preferred route for enforcement rather than going to court. And of course, private citizens can, of course, approach the courts in case they think any party is violating. Very quickly, we have a network monitoring program, which has 804 monitoring stations and 395 continuous ambient air quality monitoring stations. There's an air quality index, which is a formula to tell us, is it a severe day? Is it a very good day, bad day, something? And it's color coded. And I'm sure many of you have seen that Delhi is mostly in the most hazardous, severe area. The latest kind of policy move has been the National Clean Air Program 2019. Before this, we didn't have an air quality focused policy. Interestingly, it has actually got a reduction target of 20 to 30% in PM levels by 2024, taking 2017 as a baseline. Several other aspirational goals. But what is interesting is that it's city specific. It acknowledges the importance of regional level planning, but it actually identifies non-attainment cities. The funding is through cities. Most of the actions envisaged under the NCAP are city level, which in some senses, some people have called as a slightly blinkered vision towards air quality management. It also has funds attached to it, which I think is quite important. And there's some numbers here in terms of how much funds have been allocated for 117 cities, about 472 crores, and of which only 227 crores have been utilized. And please understand that this is 227 crores for 117 cities. So that's the amount of, it's not even peanuts, I don't know what it is, to what one should call it, but that's the money that we are thinking of to clean up. And this is cities, not the rural areas, not at the regional level, right? But some more good news is that the 15th Finance Commission has given some grants for 5 years, which is slightly more significant, 12,139 crores, but spread over 5 years for 42 million plus urban agglomerations. But this is where it becomes key. The money goes not to pollution control boards, but it goes to urban local bodies. So it will go, for instance, say Kanpur Municipal Corporation or the Kanpur Municipality or Nagpur. Now, the question is, do these urban local bodies have the capacity to actually spend this kind of money, right? There's a question of capacity in state pollution control boards, right? Which are like 40-year-old organizations, experts in pollution control. And here the money is going to urban local bodies who we all know are spread thin on various issues in which air quality is perhaps 53rd. So that's where the money is. And of course, there are many government schemes which are incentivizing things like LPG, the Ujjwala program, which is now on a hold, but it did have, a lot of studies show, have significant improvements in indoor air quality. And there are subsidies to electric vehicles and things like that, which are other kind of policies that are in place.
Civic bodies, the municipalities and civic bodies to which the money goes, do they also have an understanding of the issues?
No, we don't think so. First of all, this is all very new. I mean, the money has just started coming in. It's 2021, 22, but I think all of us who've worked with government, and we've spoken to others who have worked with ULBs, have categorically said they don't have the ability. I mean, they don't have the ability, and I think it'd be fair to say that they have other priorities.
I mean, what I was trying to say is that they might somehow spend the money.
Yeah.
But is the money going to be spent?
Absolutely,
on the right thing?
absolutely. You're absolutely right. They may say, so for instance, they may spend all the money they get, say they get 10 crore a year, they may spend it on one smog tower. And we could discuss the impact of a smog tower and wonder if 10 crores could have been better spent somewhere else. Or they could spend 10 crores on filling potholes. You could think, okay, that could reduce road dust, but maybe that money could have come from somewhere else and not money. But one thing is that these are interestingly performance-based grants. Now, this was deliberately done that every year you'll get only a percentage of what's allocated to you based on how well you did earlier. Now there's a question mark there. Now, how well they did earlier is based on how well they were equipped in the first place, right? So there's kind of a circular logic here, and it's certainly a challenge in terms of who has the institutional heft to solve this problem. So key challenges, I think the first is considering air pollution and environmental problem is our first mistake. Over the years, it's always been the Environment Department, the Environment Ministry. What happened in the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare? In fact, that ministry came up with a fantastic report in 2014-15 on the issues of indoor air quality, and which is just catching dust. But that's one of the key challenges of not looking at air quality as a holistic problem, but just as an environmental issue, which often then comes into kind of conflict with development issues, and we are developing countries and we can't think of environment, all of that then kind of just follows, and it's just not helpful. And also, I think all these studies which show that it's a public health crisis, that there is economic loss, I think that's going to be useful to breaking down this silo and making it kind of a much more holistic issue than just environmental issues. There are several weaknesses in the regulatory design. For instance, this whole thing that we need to start planning and regulating at the airshed level or the regional level is still not part of our regulation. So the Indo-Gangetic Plain acts as an airshed, and anything that happens in Punjab or Haryana, for instance, or in Delhi, then kind of flows downwind. But right now, regulation is only by state, because that's how we are organized, by administrative boundaries. Fund allocation is by state. Institutional allocation is by state. So there's very little conversation about coordinating across an airshed, or planning across an airshed is missing. Standard setting is unclear how standards are set. For some of you who may be following the power plant's emission standard process, there were some standards for power plant emissions that were supposed to come into force by 2017. They are yet being pushed back. So how those power plant emission standards were set, why are they not being implemented? How much does it cost? Is it an excuse that it's expensive? All of that kind of is an example of standard setting processes in India are completely suboptimal. Capacity constraints, I kind of briefly reflected on that, but thought I'll just give you some specifics. If we just look at the pollution control boards in India, by a 2020 study done by the Central Pollution Control Board, there's a 46% vacancy across state pollution control boards. The CPCB itself has a 15% vacancy level. So we are already working at 50%. If you then disaggregate that data, you realize the vacancies are much higher in the technical posts than in the administrative posts. So we have technical bodies who have fully occupied administrative posts, but very high vacancies in the technical posts. And then the quality of leadership. Who is the chairperson? Who is the member secretary? Which completely defines how a board would function, right? So there are several examples, and this issue has actually gone up to the Supreme Court, where people who do not even have a basic bachelor's of science degree or even a college degree are heading pollution control boards. One could argue, do you need a PhD to be a chairperson? One could, we've met in our work people who believe that it's okay to be if I'm an IS officer or an IFS officer is equally competent. And there are arguments in favor of that as well. But there is definitely a question of quality of leadership. But there's also a question of frequency in which they change. So we got some data through RTI from various states in the Indo-Gangetic Plains. And in Punjab and Haryana, we found that in 4 years in Punjab, they had 5 chairpersons. In Haryana, in 4 years, they had 5 member secretaries. So if one person is not even able to complete a year of tenure, then what kind of work are we expecting from these pollution control boards? Internal capacity is very low. And they are increasingly relying on external partners, knowledge partners, or project management units that are being set up with private players, which is good because great knowledge enhancement, but it also means that there is no move to set up institutional long-term capacities within these regulators. There's definitely a lot of flaws in the policy making. It's often ad hoc, often technocentric in the sense that it's earlier, in fact, it would always be Supreme Court has given an order, let's do this. It was always in response to something else. It's never proactive. It's not long-term. Some of the solutions, such as in stubble burning case, the solution that is either throw money at it or throw happy seeders at people. Neither of those have worked in the last 4. I mean, I'm sure the solutions work in a particular environment, or several other factors have to fall in place. Or let's set up a smog tower in Connaught Place in Delhi, and that will clean up the air of Delhi. You know, those kind of technical solutions which have little evidence to support them, but that's the kind of policy making that we see. Also, as I mentioned earlier, it's often air pollution is considered to be either an urban problem and worse still a national capital region problem. I mentioned that we have 804 monitors. By official estimates, India actually needs about 1,600 to 4,000 air quality monitors, of which we have 804. Most of these are in cities. And in fact, even some of the big cities have one. So that's just in terms of setting up, we don't even know how big a problem. So whatever I said in the first 2 slides was based on limited monitoring capacity. So if we actually had a more comprehensive monitoring capacity, I think the picture would be far more dismal. In terms of, I mean, there are of course issues in enforcement. As I said, there's limited monitoring capacity when you're going on such high vacancies. I'll not go into too much detail, but environmental damage and assessment of how what is the extent of environmental damage, how much will it cost, that's a real issue. So if we are going to ask a polluter to pay, how much does the polluter pay? How do you quantify the impact of air pollution? Because they're obviously direct and indirect, and downwind and upwind and all that. So there's a major issue of assessment of environmental compensation, environmental damage. Lack of transparency, accountability. Where are the funds being spent? As you correctly pointed out, how are they choosing projects? Why are they choosing water sprinklers over something else? So there's definitely a question of that. And finally, and I think this is really, I think important, is that hard regulation is not enough for air quality management. And by hard regulation, I mean all those laws that I said in the first slide. Issues such as stubble burning, houses, air pollution, these are not going to get solved by telling people, please stop burning firewood, use LPG. That's not, even if you put it in law and made it a criminal act, they're not going to stop doing it, because there's so many other factors that go into using biomass. It's free, easily available. LPG is expensive, not accessible all the time. There are cultural preferences. So, and stubble burning. I mean, there's apparently so much money. There's technological alternatives such as a happy seeder. Why did we see the maximum number of farm fires last year? Because there's obviously something there which regulation in itself can't solve. Maybe it's a market-based mechanism. Maybe it's public participation, getting people to talk and understand their problems. Maybe it requires upfront cash transfer. I don't know. But just to make a point here that we can't rely on law or kind of the hard regulation, but kind of regulation plus in some senses to solve this problem. Envisioning the way forward, of course, I think, as I mentioned earlier, airshed level and regional level planning is really what we need to do. We need to have mechanisms for coordination, planning, implementation, which are not restricted by administrative jurisdictional boundaries. We need to have markers for progress. So it can't just be that this city had 5 less severe days of air pollution. I mean, it could have had 25 extra days of very bad pollution, so it doesn't really. So what we need to know is, has the exposure gone down? Have the hospital visits gone down? Some other marker of progress which really reflects on air quality improvements. We need to have nimbleness in law. And by that, I mean that our regulators have to be able to exercise their autonomy. They have to be able, in the sense, have people to be able to exercise that autonomy. They should be able to respond to the situation at that point and not wait for a court case to come and end. There should be a graded, what we call a graded enforcement protocol, that if it's a minor offense, just issue a show cause notice, be done with it. But if it's a major offense, come down heavily on that person. So this kind of a graded enforcement protocol is not currently there, but if it's there, the regulators will be far more empowered. Institutional strengthening, I think I made that point earlier. And finally, I think it's important that measures are taken, all sorts of measures, policy, regulatory measures are all taken against all the major sources in parallel. Because if we prioritize one source over the other, it doesn't help, because each of them are, 1/4 of the pie. So if you manage to solve, say, industries, it doesn't help because, construction waste will just take over that space. So we have to, in some way, through deliberative and technically sound processes, attack all these sources as far as possible in parallel. So I'm going to end there. I think I overshot my time, but I'm happy to engage, take questions or comments.
Thank you, Shibani. It's such a wonderful talk. You actually made us aware about the ground realities of all the regulations that is going on in the field. So any questions? Yeah.
My question was like last year when there was COVID lockdown, air quality was improved by 60%.
Right. I'm just going to wait for this. Right. Should I take a bunch of questions or how do you want me to do it? Yeah.
2-3 questions.
You can go one by one, I think.
Okay, fair. Yeah, that's a very fair question. I think there were several studies that in fact started to see, because lockdown in some senses would give us the baseline that where we are if everything else stopped. But that's just impossible, right? That's a situation which cannot be replicated. And if it were at such high economic, all sorts of losses, it's impossible. But they also realized during those studies that our baseline is also quite high. So while there was reduction, our ambient air quality due to various reasons, whether it's anthropological reasons or natural causes, we're already above the NAAQS, right? So while it brought us down a little bit, we are already way above what's acceptable. But I don't think it's possible. It's not advisable to replicate what happened during the lockdown. We certainly have to find other ways of regulating source of pollution.
So
yes,
you spoke about policy and regulation on one hand. Where does education of the common man play a role?
Yeah,
that's important as well.
Absolutely, definitely. I think the NCAP talks a lot about awareness and the need for making people aware. I think a part of what I wanted to say when I said that hard regulation is not enough is I think that nudging factor that's required. If you're going to ask someone that please stop using your private vehicle and use public transport, then please give them good public transport. But for them to be able to make that behavioral change, we still have to create an environment where they can make those choices. But I completely take your point that I think part of this is also awareness building so that people realize the impact of their choices. And I think it's certainly an important aspect of regulation. Perhaps not an aspect that's looked at enough, but it's definitely a part of it.
Year by year, our policies are getting lenient in environment section. Like in environment clearance, in greenfield project, it's getting lenient. Means we can't, you don't have to take public opinion and all for section C class of projects. But we want, as our policy is getting lenient, but we want our air quality to get improved. How can this be balanced?
They can't be. You can't make weaker environmental policies. You can't dilute environmental regulation and expect that our environment will cope with it. I mean, it's
NGT is not taking any cases so most of the cases are either brought by them or by the activist or the RTA. Nothing, no cases.
So the NGT can take suo moto action,
but they are not taking. I guess in last 5 or 6 years, only one case was taken by suo moto case.
Not really, but I see your point. But I think I'm not sure where the courts should be where we should go, right? I mean, why should the courts tell regulators what to do? I mean, the regulators should do what they're supposed to do. I mean, the courts are important, They are, but they should be our last resort when nothing else happens. Because what then happens is that we are so used to a ineffective executive that we have no expectations from them. So we are like, chalo bhai NGT. But why? I mean, leave up. I mean, there's a whole presentation I have on how NGT doesn't have the capacity to do what it's expected to do. But that's a whole different presentation. But just to your first point, I think we cannot afford dilution of the law. The proposed EI notification 2020, which I think you were referring to, fortunately still in proposed stage, but may become reality very soon. It'll be a massive hit on environmental quality across indexes.
Ma'am, my question is that you showed us all the challenges which are there, and it's been worrisome to see that there are so many things in place. So my question here is that, who has to take care of these challenges? Who has to address these?
That institutional framework, each of them and more. And also, unfortunately, that list is a truncated list. So just to say that even more pessimistic view is that I've just identified some of the challenges. But if you're asking me where does the onus lie, I think it lies in several places. And I think that's also a cause of the problem, because no one wants to take responsibility. It's kind of, it just falls through the cracks because the center says, "Acha, ye to state ka subject hai," and then the state says, "Nahi, ye to ULB ka hai." Then ULB says, "Hamare paas paisa nahi hai." So everyone is trying to pass the buck, but the truth is that each of these actors and private actors have an important role to play. And so it's very hard to pin. Of course, on specific things you can pin responsibility. Why have the power plant emission norms not been implemented? Central government, no doubt. Right? Or you can pick up some state PCUs and PSUs and all. Yes. On specific issues, you'll be able to point to things. But the whole air quality management being an absolute failure, I think several institutional actors should take the blame.
So I have a question. So when it comes to air pollution or cutting trees, things are visible. But when it's about water pollution or soil pollution, these are invisible sort of pollution.
Yeah.
So how do these regulators really are they as strict as in the case of air pollution or cutting of trees in the similar cases of soil pollution or water pollution or the hidden forms of pollution?
It's interesting. It's interesting you're calling the air pollution the visible one, because actually air pollution was the invisible one until recently. It's so bad that it's become visible. But until recently, it was that acha kuch hai, okay, whatever, January mein aayega, fir chala jayega. Now you can but you can see it in Delhi and northern India. You can actually see. I mean, I don't know in Kanpur whether you can see it. Yeah, I would imagine. But interesting. Traditionally, the regulators, if you look at all the older reports, their focus was always water pollution, because surface water was a problem, groundwater, the water coming out from wells would have arsenic poisoning. I mean, so those kind of issues, actually, they find it easier because the lab testing mechanisms are, easier for them to monitor. So in that sense, I mean, I'm no scientist, but to me, it seems like those processes for them are better laid out. The protocol is better laid out for them. But soil pollution, I think, still is like, nobody's no. Yeah, please.
Stubble burning is what I understood. For last 20 years. It's not new. Right? Stubble burning has been there, and it is only hitting us in last 4 years.
Yes.
So nothing significant has changed in terms of the practices on the fields and everything. Right? What I didn't understand and what I think has changed is the timing of the crop burning.
Correct.
Right? Earlier, the crop was being burned at the time when the air speed was higher. So the
dispersion was
dispersed better. And now the time of crop change has changed. The crop burning has changed, and that's why the air velocity is not high. So that's why the pollutants are kind of getting stuck in there. That's what is happening. Now, this is something which is very logical problem, which could be simply solved by change of crop patterns, right? It is not a rocket science. So,
or diversification of crop. Why do you want to grow rice in Punjab? Just grow wheat and don't.
Those behavior changes will be big thing to ask. But what has happened is that the crop has been introduced in the tea.
Yes.
kind of push farmers to kind of a limit that they have no other choice but to burn the stubble in that time frame. So, like why Supreme Court is kind of directing governments to like they came up with very strongly on that all of it should stop, the government should dissolve and all the things. Like, obviously they ended on that, but just a directive coming on that will change of crop behavior, crop pattern. That could be a simple directive.
Yes. So I don't think the court should be giving such a direction, but you're absolutely right that I don't know why they think it's rocket science, because I mean, I think everyone in this room can think of 3 other solutions to that problem. And you're absolutely right that while crop burning has been happening for a long, I mean, stubble burning has been happening. It's been a kind of several things, such as they introduced a law to conserve groundwater, because of which they didn't allow sowing at a particular time, which pushed back, and which is why, you know, all that their time period window is very short, so they have no option but to. But I mean, you're absolutely, there's a provide minimum support price for crops, which diversify the crop. I mean, there's just so many other options, or allow the stagger the kind of water availability or something, which is what led to the problem in the first place. So I think that's, you know, you've really helped me make the point that this technocentric response, that if you use happy seeder, your problem will be solved, when you know happy seeder costs so much and most farmers will not be able to afford it. Not to mention, you'll not be able to manufacture it in time for the crop season. So you made the good.
Came up and shut down in a few weeks.
Yeah, happy, exactly. So thank you.
It's a behavioral and cultural practice
Also,
for farmers.
yeah.
You know, they won't change their cropping pattern until and unless they are like, you know, just.
But they were forced to.
They were, because that's what they had the MSP for. I mean, why? And the cost of, anyway, we can leave.
But mostly still they sow wheat, rice, and sugarcane.
Yeah, but then, you know, even in that they have different breeds, right? So then some breeds are more prolific, and I mean, I'm sure there are others who can say this better, which have better produce.
One person online.
We can just tell them to write in the chat box.
No, they can't chat, so you can open the chat box and security.
So,
Let me do that.
Okay.
should we just take another question?
Yeah, Shibani.
One person. You spoke about so many regulations, the regulatory body.
Sure.
What I felt, let's say there is an act which was defined for NCR, and then there is an urban local body. Do you think someone may be compliant to one of the acts, not be compliant to other? What will happen to those?
So like, if there's a conflict between the two laws, like one requires something and the other requires.
Maybe more than that, and then somebody is compliant to one of the laws and not the other. Will they be?
Yeah, so that problem is particularly glaring with the new kid on the block. So the Commission on Air Quality Management, its functions and powers are almost entirely overlapping with the existing institutions. So the state, what originally the state pollution control boards in the NCR region could do, the CAQM now has the power to do the same thing. So the law says that CAQM will be the overriding factor, but on ground there's utter confusion as to who's.
Then better to have one body than having so many, right?
I agree, which is why when the CAQM came, there was a lot of pushback. But there was a huge pushback when the CAQM came in, because it came in without any public consultation. The first ordinance came out in 4 days. And there's a whole history behind that as well, because the Supreme Court set up just a Justice Local Committee, like a one-person committee, and the central government didn't want that. So within overnight, they came up with the CAQM ordinance. So whether we want one institution or several institutions is something I think that needs to be publicly debated.
What the body will be face conflict, like who will be overriding body eventually?
Yeah, well, then, yes, that certainly is a question mark there.
It is not being shared.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
So very interesting, very good, very nice presentation.
Thank you.
Right? So I'm not from the field, so it could be a live question. So government is installing more and more of these sensors, right?
Yeah.
Air quality index measurement sensors, and these could be one in a city or could be more in a city, right? But these are like in a particular location in a city.
Yes.
Right. So they will be generating local data.
Yes.
And is that local data enough to come up with policies for the entire city? Some areas could have more pollution, some areas could have less pollution.
No, not at all.
How do you solve that?
Not at all. I mean, I think the solution is to have as many monitors as possible and to place the monitors strategically. So, I mean, there are places in which they have set up monitors in places like IIT, I mean, not in IIT, but places which are educational institutions which are absolutely green. I mean, what is the point of putting a monitor inside? I mean, what kind of data are you going to generate from there? Exactly, absolutely. So you're absolutely spot on that, you know, one part of the solution is certainly monitoring capacity has to be ramped up. And whether that happens through, I mean, there's a debate and people from IIT Kanpur are also part of the debate in terms of whether more low-cost sensors need to be put and what the validity of those will be. And I think more sensors, the better. I mean, in some cases you may get poor data, fine, but it's not like this 804 monitoring stations are giving you some 100% fantastic data. But
Yeah, just a small clarificatory question.
Yes, please.
So my question was that when you were talking about all these policies that are in place, so one of the things that you talked about was the fact that some of these industries have to give a certain amount of money if they were violating the existing levels of air pollution, whatever is allowed, right? So is it different for different types of industries? The first thing that came to my mind was that these bigger or richer organizations would definitely be maybe okay giving these fines versus say smaller ones. So I feel like, so is it different for these different kind of industries?
So first of all, there's a problem there,
Yeah.
and it's a so there are a few problems here. First of all, there's a big problem in, you know, we have this polluter pays principle in law. Basically, please, if you're polluted, you pay up. But it's unfortunate in regulation, it's turned it over its head and says you pay and then you pollute. So that becomes a problem, particularly like you pointed out for the richer industries who are like, okay, so the pollution control board is going to ask me to pay 10 lakh rupees. I'll just factor it in and pass on the cost. So you're absolutely spot on. The second problem is what I pointed out is an assessment of damages. So you just don't know what has damaged and how much would it cost. Third is, if you've even done that, you have got the money, how will you spend the money? Like, who is spending the money on restoration of the damaged environment is also an issue. But in law, there is a principle that a bigger industry which has the capacity to pay should pay more. Because the concept is that some of this should be a deterrent. So a 15 lakh rupees would be a deterrent to a smaller company and will be a zero deterrence to a much larger company. So in law, certainly there is a concept where it should be higher for bigger companies.
Only two more questions are allowed because we are running out of time. Yeah.
Now, mainly the focus of the pollution control board was on water and air. But are there any regulations or have there been any cases for maybe solar panel disposals or battery waste disposals or electronic waste? So have there been any recent cases here?
So I can't say about solar panel, though I'm sure it will become an issue very soon. But sorry, I didn't mention it because given the scope of the presentation, but e-waste, bio-waste, hazardous waste, all of that actually, there are specific rules under the Environment Protection Act. And for each of them, the pollution control boards do play a role, but there are other bodies also which play a role. So all of these are actually regulated in some sense. To what extent is the question, but there is specific rules for electronic waste. There are different set of rules for plastic. There's a different set of rules for hazardous waste, biomedical waste. There are different regulations for that.
So just wanted to ask you, all these acts and laws which have been drafted in India, are these Indian context specific or are they just copies of Western?
Good question. Well, it's not just the laws, it's also what we do with it after that. Also, sometimes it feels like we are picking and cherry picking from different. So all of these laws have some kind of historical basis. So for instance, the Air Act, and the Air Act refers to the Stockholm Conference, and 1986 Act came soon after an industrial blast in Delhi and the Bhopal gas tragedy. So there is some historical context to that. But I do agree, not these acts themselves, but sometimes when we have looked at some of the more kind of rules and notifications, we have picked from places which may not be suitable or which may not be exactly customized to the Indian, because some of this is like you are assuming you have full capacity to implement the law. I mean, why are you assuming? Do you not know the capacity? So why would you come up, for instance, you've come up with a commission on air quality management. Have you learned from 20 years of EPCA? so those kind of learnings, have they seeped in? I don't think so.
Do we have any questions from our online participants?
No, I think
I
we're
think
all
we
set.
don't have. So now I would like to invite Professor Garg to give a kind of from our center.